to you. At the college, we believe that the future of design is multidisciplinary, and we host a range of design degrees that include graphic design, product and transportation design, game design, interiors, and architecture. We track design future trends, emerging technologies, and advancements in practice as a means of crafting education approaches in these areas. Our design and technology lecture series allows us to engage in design discussions and offer broad perspectives on where we are headed. So a bit of housekeeping, some reminders. On Thursday, April 11th, Ralph Nelson will present Energy in Architecture. And you can register for this lecture by going to our co-ed events page and clicking lectures. Today, Melissa Kagen will lecture on wandering games. At the end of the lecture, we will have time for a 15-minute Q&A question session. Dr. Kagen is an assistant teaching professor in the Interactive Media and Game Development program and the Game Studies and academic writer. After receiving her PhD in literature from Stanford University in 2016, she was a lecturer in digital media and gaming at Bangor University, a visiting scholar at the MIT Game Lab in association with the Board Games and Colonialism Project, and an assistant professor of communication with a focus on gaming and streaming at Curry College. Dr. Kagan's work has been published in Game Studies, Convergence, Game Environments, Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds, Year's work in Nerds, Wonks, and Neocons, Opera Quarterly and German Quarterly, and other popular outlets like The Guardian and SideQuest. She also serves as an associate editor of the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds. Please help me welcome Melissa Kagen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. Was there another audiovisual thing you wanted me to do, or can I just switch over now? Awesome. Sweet, it worked. Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Professor Jolach for inviting me. Thank you to Andrea. Thank you to Tammy. I'm very excited to be here and to be able to talk to you about this project that I actually brought a physical copy of. So this is going to be based on this book that came out a year and a half ago. The book is also, I want to note, open source. So if any of this interests you, you can jump on the MIT Press website and you can download any of these chapters as a PDF. I was very happy about that particular negotiation. So yeah, wandering games. What is that? I started off this project about 10 years ago at this point. I started by asking some questions about what it means to be a wandering body in a game world, and what happens when we take the wandering parts of a game seriously. We spend so much time, those of us who play a lot of games, spend so much time wandering through these digital worlds, either kind of semi-literally or spatially, I could say, sort of wandering around sandbox games or open world games. And then also metaphorically by digressing through interactive storylines that may meet up in places or may just diverge and branch eternally. And so I was really interested in using this project to think about moving all of that wandering that we're doing from the background to the foreground. What happens if I take a look at a whole bunch of games that are not ostensibly about wandering and take the wandering in those games seriously? To back up a little bit more, I started with the semi-notorious, infamous walking simulator genre, which is probably what some of you might have thought of immediately when I say a term like wandering games. I started off this project kind of writ large way back in 2012, 2013, when I was a PhD student in German literature. Was actually what I got my PhD in. I was really interested in the concept of wandering in German Jewish opera. So very quickly, I promise I won't spend too much time on Jewish German opera. But there is a legendary figure called the Wandering Jew, which is a type of wandering that is very negatively construed. The Wandering Jew, it's an anti-Semitic European legend, and the Wandering Jew is a figure who's cursed to wander eternally, like can't stop wandering. And then there is a German wanderer who's like a Goethean romantic style, young male adventurer who we would find very familiar in a game context, goes out into the world, has adventures, learns lots of things, comes back stronger for it. So while I was working on this dissertation project, I was getting really into the idea of wandering not just as being about these figures, but as a kind of form. I started thinking about wandering types of music. I started thinking about, like as in tonal harmony that wanders, which is a thing. I started thinking about digressive literature, so texts that kind of wander or are said to wander. The modernists and after do a lot of wandering literature. Pedestrian performance. I was directing a whole bunch of these operas that I was setting as pedestrian performances, where the piece itself would be performed in different spaces, and then the audience would move through it to experience it. So at some point in all of this wandering fixation, someone said to me, you should really check out these new at the time walking simulators. This is a type of media form that is literally all about the wandering. It kind of takes away everything other than the wandering, and you're just moving through these digital spaces. So I started thinking about games like Gone Home, Dear Esther. I'm just going across the top. Gone Home, Dear Esther. This is just a picture of the Flaneur, because that's kind of where I was coming from at the time. And then on the lower level, that's The Path from 2006 by Tale of Tales. A little less well known, but it's definitely one of the precursors to the walking sim genre. Everybody's Gone to the Raptures in the center, and then Firewatch and What Remains of Edith Finch, which are both a little bit later. So started thinking about these walking simulators, playing these walking simulators, and before I knew it, I was out of German and into games and thinking about wandering in a different context. Not that I really think it's terribly possible to summarize the book in a slide, but here's the slide to the extent that it is. What I found was that ludic wandering, so wandering in games, can subvert cultural expectations about work, gender, colonialism, and death. Oh, good, and this screen is so big that you can actually see this, it looks really tiny on my screen, but this is very great. So ludic wandering subverts, or can subvert, different cultural expectations. I realized, or I think, that there are certain expectations that are just baked in to our understanding of the world, and therefore also our understanding of game worlds that we enter into. And when we focus on the wandering that's happening in those games, those expectations can get subverted. For example, an expectation about work. There is this expectation that productivity and hustle culture is a good thing. The gig economy is an inevitability. It's all underlied by the Protestant work ethic. Basically, work, work, work all the time. Work is good. Work is a moral good. And we see this in games, too. A whole lot of games, if you break them down and you take away the stuff that's ostensibly fun about them, is doing a task, getting assigned a task, doing a task, trying it again and again, failing at it a whole bunch, and then eventually succeeding, and some sort of authority figure, or maybe the game itself, pats you on the head and gives you a gold star and a bunch of points and says, good job, we're going to give you a promotion, or we're going to give you, a better weapon or access, some sort of reward of access, and then you keep going. So it's basically a type of work in a different form, and one of the things that wandering does in a game is it subverts that. Because when you're wandering, you're just doing nothing. You're sort of moving around in the space, and you're not doing the work of play, which we've come to expect as being the experience of playing a game. It's I'm going to do my play work, and then I'm going to get all my coins, and that'll feel good. So wandering is a way of doing nothing, which is subversive as games get increasingly work-like, and work gets increasingly omnipresent. Gender. The wanderer is typically this brave young man adventurer, and the male part is important. A brave young man who adventures through the world and fights off all challengers. And the subversion is that the freedom to wander has traditionally been the purview of this solely male adventurer, and there has been sometimes violent pushback to those who are not male going wandering in game worlds as well as in physical spaces. Colonialism. There is this expectation when we enter, especially a first-person shooter, but really a lot of different types of game landscapes, that this land is here for me to explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. 4X is a type of game. This is actually more on the surface than it is in a whole lot of different genres, like film. And so first-person games encourage this manifest destiny mindset, and even, especially when a game world is empty of other people, as it often is in the games that I'm looking at. We need to think about why the landscape seems to be waiting for us to violently explore and loot and conquer it. And then finally, death, which is at the center of so many games. So many games are really just about death, and I kind of want to write a book that's entirely like just about death. But the expectation is I will die a whole lot in a game, and I will be surrounded by death, but it won't mean anything. The death never means something. Anytime I die, I'll just go back to the previous save point. Anytime I kill something, I will get to probably loot that creature or monster or whatever for something useful to me. And even if I don't, the body will probably just disappear, like in like in Zelda, like the poof of smoke, and the corpse just like goes away. And so we are constantly practicing dying, in a sense, when we play games. And we will often wander through dead, haunted worlds, especially in walking simulators. Walking simulators are full of dead, haunted worlds. But I argue in the last chapter of the book that wandering in big, violent AAA games is actually a kind of spiritual practice, or it can be a spiritual practice of pilgrimage and acceptance of death, that you're kind of practicing over and over how to die and what it is to die. And it's actually more spiritually meaningful than it necessarily feels like when you're doing it. So why is this important? I'm probably speaking to people who agree with me. This is not as hard a lift as it sometimes is when one makes this point, because I think you probably agree that games are important. But games are the most persuasive and immersive artistic texts shaping our culture today. So the sometimes subtle ways that games condition our expectations will structure what we expect in our lives. If a game trains us to expect certain things, then we will practice that expectation over and over again, and it will affect the way we perceive the structures in our world. It will affect what we expect politically. There are ways that games kind of shift the Overton window of what is and isn't possible to talk about in the public sphere. So it's important to think about the ways that games are training us to think, and how, as game designers, we can either support those expectations if we want to, or subvert them in ways that might make our games better, and also change culture in ways that we might want it to change. Okay, so I'm now going to go through the book and talk a little bit about the arguments, and then I am going to turn to, okay, so how, if we take this analysis of games, how can we use it as game designers in the last 10 or 15 minutes? All right, so in the intro, I do the background of all of this different intellectual thinking about walking and wandering that I want to bring into the discussion of wandering in games. Things like protest movements and subversive walks in general. Pedestrian performance, like I talked about, is kind of the theatrical version of wandering through a text. Digressive literature, books that wander, and then I bring that all together into the concept of walking in games. This kind of summary chapter is more about making visible a whole bunch of these intellectual threads that are totally present in the digital worlds that we experience, but that we don't usually see as sort of being related. Like, we don't typically see that the way that we move through a game space is related to the revolution of 1968. But it totally is. Like, very directly it is. And so it's interesting to see how that works. And then I start with a couple chapters on work. I talk about Return of the Obra Dinn, which is a fantastic puzzle game in which you play as an insurance adjuster for the East India Company. You go onto a ghost ship that has come into the harbor of London, and everyone on board is dead. And so you are wandering through that ship, you are finding all the corpses, and then you are using your magical pocket watch to go back to the exact moment of death to try to figure out the answer to 2 questions for everyone on the ship. The 2 questions are, and there's a screenshot of it up there, who is this and how did they die? So this is what I am calling an archive of corpses, which is kind of interesting because usually you have objects that turn into corpses, but in a lot of games. But here you have corpses that kind of turn into memories. So as you move through, you are caring for this archive of corpses. And something that's interesting, or particularly interesting about this game, is the disjoint between you as the player character, the insurance adjuster, who's kind of there to do a job, and you as the player who's not there to do a job. The game makes you, in order to win the game, you need to start caring about all of these people who are on board. You need to notice lots of little details. Oh, this person in the hat did this with this other person who was in the rigging that time. And so now I can see how later you basically trace out what happened to them their last day, and in that way you get to know them. And then at the end, the insurance adjuster goes through and is like, this is what this death was worth, this is how much we're gonna pay out to this widow, et cetera, and it feels really jarring because you got to care about these people as people, and then you are confronted with how someone who is working on this as an insurance adjuster doesn't care about them at all. So in Obra Dinn, ludic wandering trains us to care about these characters' deaths, which draws attention to the focused, uncaring work the player character has to do under capitalism. It's this disjoint between kind of like work and not work. Although it's also interesting because those of us who work on games have like another level of it, because we're like, oh, I am playing this game like as work technically, but like not as an insurance adjuster. And then in the second chapter, I'm still thinking about work, but I'm turning towards Eastshade, which is a beautiful, beautiful indie game about traveling this like bucolic pastoral landscape as a traveling artist. You are wandering around the landscape and you are painting paintings, and it's just like the most romantic, like big R romantic fantasy of like what work could be as a creative, to just like travel this landscape and paint pictures. However, it is also an RPG. So as you get into it, you realize pretty quickly that there are all of these different economies at play. You need to talk to this person to gain this money, to gain this level of inspiration so that you can paint your painting. And so in this, we move very quickly from this like romantic fantasy of creative work as like nothing but like inspiration writ large to this like very practical like bean counting, all right, I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and I have to save my inspiration for the paintings that are commissioned rather than the paintings I might really want to do. So I tie this in the third section to the labor that the game developers did, and that's this third picture. This is one of the pieces that this is one of the promotional videos that they put out, which is basically like a whole like minute of the dev like going through. It was one major dev. Going through a day and like coding and then getting up to make ramen, and then like a substantial portion of the video is them like making ramen, and so this is also a way that like creatives have to kind of perform both their love of work and the precarity that they live under. This is what the character in the game is doing. This is also what the game developers are doing in the way that they promote this game. So in Eastshade, ludic wandering feels romantic and fantastical, which juxtaposes with the economies of labor the player character engages in, as well as the precarious labor of the game developers who made Eastshade. Love your work is a beautiful trap for creatives, is another thing that I think this game, you can read into this game even if it's not explicitly saying it. Then I do a chapter on gender, looking at this pretty, not very well-known game, quite indie, this particular game. It's called Ritual of the Moon. Has anyone actually played Ritual of the Moon, by the way? I've rarely come across someone who has played it. But if you want a real like mind mess. It's pretty interesting. You can only play it for 5 minutes every day, but you have to play it every day for 28 days. You are a witch who has been exiled to the moon for your powers, and every day a comet comes and is going to destroy the Earth. That's this top screenshot. And you have to decide whether to use your power to move the comet so it doesn't crash, or let it crash, because those people exiled you anyway. You have to decide to do this every day for 28 days. Any day that you as the player miss, the comet will crash. So you miss even one day and the Earth is destroyed. And there are 6 different endings. I mean, the Earth isn't destroyed, but like, you know, it's a really big comet. Like, you can kind of assume the Earth is basically destroyed. So the space itself is really constrained. The only things you do on the day, you walk into this space pod, you do a little ritual where you connect a constellation, you say a mantra, and then you walk out and make your decision about whether or not to let the comet crash. So this is a female player character. It's made by a women of color dev team. And there's a whole lot of interesting stuff about queer temporality and crypt time and disability that's all written into this game. And in Ritual of the Moon, ludic wandering is constrained in time and space, which leads to the player and the player character wandering internally. This strategy echoes a long-time strategy for those in marginalized bodies, queer people, people of color, disabled people, and women. Basically, the wandering is constrained here. We don't have, it's the opposite of some big open world, like, go out as Link and like explore everything kind of a game. It's very tightly constrained. So what can you do instead in that situation? You do this internal wandering, which is a long-term strategy for a whole lot of people. In the next couple chapters, I turn towards thinking about different strategies for anti-colonialism in game design. I look at 80 Days, which is a game about the Jules Verne novel, or it's an adaptation of the Jules Verne novel. You're trying to get around the world in 80 days. And for this game, or for this chapter, I look at these 3 different ways of seeing space, and I point to 80 Days as a game that I think does a really good job with it. 80 Days has you travel through the world, which is quite different from the way that most games teach you to perceive the world. In 80 Days, ludic wandering is framed as traveling through a world that is filled with other interesting people and stories. Basically, the game doesn't let you access all of the things you might want to access. There are some parts of the game that no matter what conversational trees you pick or what objects you try to give, you can't fulfill your desire to know certain things about this world, which is really effective as both a storytelling technique and as a game that increases its replay value, because you keep wanting to be able to access certain things, and there are some things that you just can't. This also gives this sense that the world is bigger than you as the player character. You can't have everything you want, which is pretty effective in a media form where you usually can have everything you want. If you get good enough, you can pretty much have everything you want in a whole lot of games, and you can't in this one. And it's a really interesting technique, basically. This contrasts with plenty of other games, which, like I said, are basically manifest destiny mindset. Players are trained to perceive a landscape as an imperial conqueror would, or in some cases, to be assured that the conquest is inevitable. And then another game that I think does a good job at anti-colonialist game design praxis is Heaven's Vault. In Heaven's Vault, you play, oops, too fast. You play as Aaliyah. She has been educated at a university at the center of this galaxy. This is a map of the, not the galaxy, but this is the map of kind of the landscape that she's flying her craft through on these rivers that she thinks have been just existing forever. And then it turns out that they were actually carved, and they're actually a construct of the Empire. She's been educated at the center of the Empire. She was born and raised on a colonized world. And she's slowly going through the game, learning this language that was lost, this ancient language. And the way the game is constructed, as she gets more and more interested in the language, and as you, the player, keep like wanting to learn more about the language, you're kind of digressing to like go to a different moon. You learn a little bit more. That takes you on another digression. It's basically a game that's entirely full of digressions. It's at a certain point you've totally lost track of like what the main thrust of the story is, and that is. I'm not going to spoil the end of the game for you, but it kind of comes up big in the end, where all of that practicing of digression kind of explodes in this possibility for you to make a really dramatic choice about how to kind of undo the workings of Empire. So in Heaven's Vault, ludic wandering through both space and language primes the player to see space and language as constructions of Empire, which they are, and through recurring digressions, destroy both constructions. And then finally, AAA games like Death Stranding and The Last of Us Part 2. I picked two games that are particularly post-apocalyptic and post-death. So in both of these games, the main player character has some sort of post-death issue, we're gonna say, like as in they can't die. So they just are kind of cursed to keep wandering, even if they might not want to. This works really well because we want to keep playing them. So even after they die, we just like keep reviving them like over and over and over again, which if you think about it from the player character perspective is like actually really disturbing. Anyway, these are beautiful, lush games. I think about them as post-apocalyptic pastorals, like this green, lush landscape that they are wandering through. The Walking Dead is a great example of a post-apocalyptic pastoral. All of that gorgeous green space in The Walking Dead, like getting away from the cities and like getting back to nature, is a post-apocalyptic pastoral. But in these landscapes, they are doing this endless wandering. And they're also killing a lot and being killed a lot as the player gets better at playing as the character. So what's that about? I think that in Death Stranding and The Last of Us Part 2, ludic wandering is an endless pilgrimage through a post-apocalyptic, post-death world. The player character is trying and failing to sew a pastoral past back together with their feet, but they never do. They keep wandering. In both of these games, you finish the main thrust of the story, and they're just, both of these characters are continuing on, or one of the main characters in The Last of Us Part 2. There are two. So, with all that said, some practical takeaways, or if not takeaways, then some practical ideas for how you can turn what is an analytic approach, a framework for understanding how to think about games, how you can use this in your design practice. If I started with the question, what does wandering mean in this game, which is a good way to analyze a game if that's what you're into, as a designer, you might want to reformulate that question and have it instead be something like, what do I want wandering to mean in my game? So this is a list of different things that wandering can mean in a game, which I talk about in the intro. There are more things that wandering can also mean, but for example, escaping, traversing, meandering, erring, resisting, returning, marching, journeying, different valences of wandering. So you can pick one of those. And then instead of the question, what cultural expectation does ludic wandering in this game subvert? It could be, what cultural expectation could ludic wandering in my game subvert? And I've got these 4 cultural expectations that I came up with on here. There are more. It's just that I had to finish the book somewhere, but there are plenty more, I'm sure. So in thinking about these expectations, I wanted to kind of cross-reference this with a talk that I saw after the book was already baked, but that I thought was really interesting. So Meg Giant has this keynote in 2021 that she gave at Digra India. It's on YouTube, and it's also all written out on her website if you want to, like the whole essay is there if you want to check that out. It's called White Protagonism and Imperial Pleasures in Game Design. And one of the things she does in that keynote and essay is she lists a set of expectations, or what she calls injunctions, that the player expects when they enter into a game world. And she's specifically talking about colonialism and race in her keynote. which is an element of my book, but it's not all of it. But I think this list of injunctions is really interesting. The white protagonist is a hero. The white protagonist is the only entity that matters in the world, which is to say the only human in a world of objects. The white protagonist will increase in power as the story unfolds. As I read the essay and as I read them through, I was like, yeah, this is a great kind of summary of what we come into a game expecting. It doesn't mean that every game does this. Certainly not. You can think of plenty of counterexamples of games that don't do this, but it's notable when a game doesn't do this. You might go into a game expecting that and then go, oh, that's interesting. It's interesting that I do some bad thing and then I'm not forgiven. Usually I would just expect to be immediately forgiven by the villagers after I rampage through and steal all their corn and knock over all their urns. Like, of course I would expect to be forgiven. So if a game were to have me do that and then not forgive me, that could be interesting. So for one thing, I wanted to shout this out because it's a great essay, and also because one of the things that you can do as a designer is to figure out what your player is going to come into your game expecting, and then figure out how you can generatively twist that, and then give them something that you're not expecting. Doing that sort of thing will not only sort of be, at least in this case, kind of anti-racist practice, but it's also a good way to make a really unique game that is going to subvert expectations that people will not walk into your game subverting. So one exercise, I think, is to take one of these, just one, and then try to imagine a game that subverts it, and think about what the play would be for that. Okay, and then I wanted to do a couple examples of how I might go through this game analysis to design exercise. That said, for the record, I think this works better if you take a design you're working on already and ask these questions of it as you develop the game, rather than starting a design from scratch and asking these questions. Not to say you can't start from scratch, but I think this can work at any point in the process. And in some ways, it's better to do it on a game that you started designing not thinking about any of these questions, and then at some point in your development process, you subject it to these questions to see how you can complicate it or influence it the direction that it's going. So if I want wandering to be about returning in my game, remember this list, I picked this actually with a dice. I picked both of these things with die. I rolled for it, which is good game design practice in general. I want wandering to be about returning. So going away and coming back is the loop that I want my player to experience again and again. In that case, I would have to answer questions like, why is the player motivated to go? And why is the player motivated to come back? And then for what it subverts, I want ludic wandering in my game to subvert a colonialist mindset, which again is the idea that this world is here for me to explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And then I will need to figure out what the core mechanics are to my game. And so when I looked at this set that I rolled for, it's like, okay, well, this reminded me of, has anyone read Becky Chambers? Anyone know Becky Chambers, a really good solar punk novelist who wrote A Psalm for the Wild Built, A Prayer for the Crown Shy, or A Prayer for the Crown Shy. Anyway, it's a world in which the main character is a tea monk who travels all over the countryside and offers people tea and listens to their problems, and it's just like super lovely solar punk. Solar punk is an imagining of the future with a ton of technology, but it's really positive. It's like not a dystopia is like the core of solar punk. So lovely worlds to spend some time in if you're interested in that. So why is the player motivated to go? I am a tea monk who travels the countryside. That's why I have to go. I have to roll it's actually like a tea bicycle, he bikes it like all across the landscape. So I'm gonna travel the countryside and offer tea. And why are they motivated to come back? Let's say I want to end each day having tea with my grandmother. Fine. So here's our loop. Every day I'm going to go out, and every day I'm going to come back. If I want the ludic wandering to subvert a colonialist mindset. Then I'm going to take that 80 days trick and say some visitors won't like my tea, and I won't be able to help them, and I won't therefore be able to get ingredients from them. And so core mechanics are going to be brew and talk. I'm brewing tea and I'm talking to people, and those things will then feed back into each other. The core mechanics or the verbs of your game, as you know, but I'm going to repeat in case anyone doesn't, you want them to talk to each other and to affect each other. You want brew to affect talk, and you want talk to affect brew, and you want to start out with only 1 or 2 or maybe 3 core mechanics, because you want to really develop all of the relationships between them and the objects in the world. So at each stop, I will brew tea for each visitor and talk to them. If I help them, they will give me an ingredient I might need to brew the next cup of tea. And then I will go home and do this process with my grandmother, but in reverse. My grandmother will brew me tea and tell me a story, and if it helped me, I will give her an ingredient I think she'll like. Cozy game, right? Okay, another example with a little more conflict in it, and I think I have yet to come up with an example that has like tons of conflict in it. I think it could be done, but I think in these 2 examples, there's not tons of conflict in it. This one has a bunch of death, though, because when I rolled, I got escaping, so getting away from a bad situation. Here the questions are a little different. Why is the player motivated to go, and where is the player trying to get to? And what should ludic wandering subvert? The expectation around death. I'll die a lot in this game, and I'll be surrounded by death, but it won't mean anything. So what does that look like? This was not inspired by Becky Chambers, or anyone. It's a little Undertale-y, and a couple other, it's a little Highland Tale too, actually. It's very tale. Anyway, so I am a ghost bear. Player character is a ghost bear, and I've discovered that there is a monster that eats ghosts in this world, and I am running from that. I am trying to get to a land of honey across the mountains. I'm trying to find it while also not getting eaten by the ghost eater. And subverting the expectation around death. Whenever anything attacks me, I can fight it, and I can choose to eat it, but then it will become a ghost in my stomach, making it more likely that the ghost eater will find me. Basically, I become this more concentrated ghost. The core mechanics of this game are looking like eat, run, and dream, because eat and run are a little too platformy. Although maybe I would just start with eat and run and probably like not add dream until eat and run was a nice core loop already. I need to eat and dream to keep up my energy to run. Some things I eat will help and some will hurt. And I have convoluted dreams that tell me hints of where to go next, but they are easy to misinterpret. So what is important here, I think, is to think about how you're training your player, who is also a citizen of the planet, to think and not think. Are you reinforcing certain cultural expectations? Are you subverting them? What are you taking for granted? And could it be generative for you as a game designer to make that invisible thing visible? I do not think that every game needs to do everything, nor can it. I don't think every game needs to be intentionally subversive, although I do think that games get a lot of replay value out of giving players the ability to subvert whatever it is that the game designer wanted to do. People love subverting things, and if you give your players to play back, if you give your players the opportunity to play back against the system that you've constructed, they will, and they'll do it in really interesting ways sometimes, if you've given them the possibility space to do it. But I do think that it's important to choose intentionally and to decide what is it that I'm reinforcing, what is it that I want to subvert, and how can I make sure that players are able to do and not do the things that I think will make the most effective experience. So that is exactly 40 minutes on the dot. Love it. Any questions? And also thank you so much again to Professor Yolach, to Andrea Bogert, Tammy Stenko, and the whole Design and Technology series. Thanks.
What's your favorite wandering game? Oh, wait, because, sorry, it's for YouTube.
We need it for YouTube.
What's your favorite favorite wandering game, and why would you recommend playing it?
So the question was, what's your favorite wandering game, and why would you recommend playing it? Yeah, my favorite by far was, not by far, actually, I mean, I loved all of these games, and that was part of why I wanted to write about them. But I'll just jump back to it. Eastshade. Eastshade was the one that was the most, it was the one that I kept coming back to, the one that I felt the most pull towards. I would recommend playing it because it is both so cozy and so beautiful. The whole world is really well depicted, well built, and the mechanics of it work really nicely together. The game loops are kind of inside of one another, and the whole landscape is like one more like beautiful, magical surprise to explore. I think I was in part so drawn to it because of what I wanted to write about and what I wound up writing about. Like, I love my work. I've found it interesting for years now to kind of think about what is gained and what gets lost when you love your work. I think anyone in a creative industry has to think about this. There's so much pressure, there's so much mustard put on the idea of loving your work. And I think Eastshade is kind of a game where you really get to sink into the fantasy that loving your work is great. Like, there's no problem with it. Nothing will ever go wrong with it. You will never be exploited by like some company that like really takes it for granted that you love your work. You can just settle into it, and like the people are just good. The commissions are interesting. You get to paint all the paintings you want. So I really enjoyed that fantasy, and I would totally recommend playing that game.
I only feel a little silly speaking into the microphone when we're like right here. So yeah, there was also like, I was looking at all like the books that you had up in the corners, and I was like, oh, I like that one. That one's good. Yeah. One of the things that you brought up, there was one book that was talking about like literature and how games can be perceived as literature in some way. And I felt a lot of the time that like games are definitely not taken as seriously as like a movie or a book, and I think for a lot of reasons it's like those other things are seen as like sites of analysis, whereas games are for some reason seen as sites of play, despite the fact that they can be engaged with in very similar ways. So yeah, that's the sort of thing I've come back to, is like somehow play is disconnecting people from the actual like meaningful content of the game. And I'm curious if there's other ways that you've seen where people are disconnecting from the game narrative as something serious and meaningful, or something that can be thought of or analyzed like literature.
Yeah, so the question started out as a nice critique of how in some cases games are not taken as seriously as other forms of media, as seriously as objects of analysis, as other forms of media, which I totally agree with, but also think is changing and has changed quite a bit in the last 10 years. And then the second part of the question was, do I see other ways that, what was it? Do I see other ways that games are not being taken as seriously as literature, or are being?
Other reasons people are able to sort of detach games as something disconnected from literature.
I see. Other ways that people are able to detach games as something disconnected from literature. So there was a big fight among academics in the early years of game studies that it's called the narratology-ludology debate, which was not a real debate, never a real debate, was always just a way for some people to get tenure, and everyone needed to stake out their theoretical positions to get tenure. So I will die on that hill. It's not a real thing. Games are both made of narrative and can be analyzed through tools like film theory and literary theory and et cetera. They are certainly not media objects that exist sui generis and just sprang into being in 1980. They have lots of precursors, and we can certainly analyze them through the tools that we've developed to study those precursors. And also, games are unique, as every media form is. And in games, you are So Si-Tai Nguyen has this great book about art as agency, and basically makes the argument that games are about playing with agency. We are able to both have agency in games. We can affect the interactive narrative. We can change the story and what happens. And we can also be constrained. And since we expect that agency, you can do interesting things as a game designer to kind of prevent people from being as fully agential as they expect to be in a game. So there's kind of space on both sides of that to really to kind of do things as a designer. I think that disconnect is coming together a little bit more. I think there's now been enough research and enough really interesting like subfields of game studies that have come about that have done a lot of work in like establishing game studies as like something that is literarily or is theoretically important. There's like a lot of crossover with subdisciplines. Like this book by Olinda Chang called Playing Nature is about game studies and ecology, and she talks about the environments, the landscapes in which games take place, and it's totally fascinating, that like subgenre crossover. Bo Ruberg also has books on games and queer studies, and the field of queer game studies is explosively exciting and has been now for actually 10 years. So I think like a lot of those subgenres where like games are getting analyzed through the lens of queerness or the lens of gender or the lens of ecology or the lens of anthropology or architecture. There's like a lot of interesting work that's being done at in those subgenres that I think is helping make the field a lot more interesting and also making games like more established as like a theoretical, like something that like makes sense to study theoretically, because so many people are coming into games from all different areas. Did that answer your question? Okay, great.
So to bounce off the previous question about like games being taken seriously as like kind of like relating to literature or like in general like storytelling, I know some games have been made into like shows or movies like The Last of Us or like even like the Mario movie in theory. Do you think that those kinds of adaptions into like that form of media help like how games are taken seriously, or kind of hurt them more so because like there feels like there needs to be some kind of separate adaptation of them?
The question was, I think, so there are a lot of games that are or have been getting adapted into films or TV series. Do I think that that's helping them be taken more seriously or not? And I think in classic academic form, I'm not really going to answer the question. I'm going to say that it is, I think that it's inevitable that games will get taken more and more seriously as more people come into them and as we have more generations who grew up playing games and then like come into intellectual maturity, like ready to think about them. I think that it's also inevitable that such popular cultural objects like The Last of Us Part 2 is going to get adapted because like, hey, someone can make money doing that. So like, of course that's gonna happen. I don't think those creators, like, I don't know exactly the team behind that miniseries, the Last of Us Part 2, which I loved, by the way. I thought that was great. I don't think they were necessarily thinking about like, hey, this is gonna make people think more or less seriously about games. I think it is a window into games for some people who might not be players and who might feel a little bit like people who might never play The Last of Us will have seen it or heard it. It's a lower barrier to entry. And so I think over time that brings more people into games, which over time means that there is going to be more people who, a subsection of whom will want to take them seriously. It's always kind of weirdos or like, you know, the kind of nerd crust of any art form that's like really going to care about taking something seriously, who really cares about experimental film nerds, who really cares about experimental literature and, you know, doesn't want like a beach read, but wants something that's like weightier, like they really want to think about it and like have their mind blown. So I think in that sense, the more people who come into games and get really into playing them, the more interesting types of games we're going to get, because we're going to have bigger audiences, and then devs are going to create more games for those audiences.
So in games like Ritual of the Moon, where the entire crux of the game is basically presenting the player with a choice where one option is kind of morally correct and the other one is a little bit more morally gray, is it arguably wrong to kind of tempt or suggest to the player that they should take the dark choice so that way they can experience the full impact of what you're trying to say with the game?
Is it, in Ritual of the Moon, is it morally wrong of, you mean like the developers? Like, is it morally wrong of them?
To like, kind of throughout the course of the story, suggest to the player that they should, and kind of tempt the player to take the choice that is arguably morally gray.
Is it morally wrong for the developers of Ritual of the Moon to suggest or tempt the player into committing planeticide, xenocide, to sort of tempt them into like committing this like ultra-violent act? No, not at all. I think that devs games in general give us the possibility of playing with all sorts of moral choices in a playground space where none of it is real. And I think that that's one of the beautiful things that games bring us. I think that if you feel if you are a marginalized player and you feel a sense of rage at the inequities of a system that has been excluding you and there's been nothing you're able to do about it, engaging with a text like Ritual of the Moon, where you can just decide for 28 days to crash a comet into the side of the Earth, and like that can be a really cathartic way and a really healthy way of dealing with feelings that might otherwise not have as healthy an outlet. So no, I don't think it's wrong. I don't think it's morally wrong for the developers to kind of like create this possibility. I think that it's interesting as a player to think about how much of you is in that choice and how much you're like playing a character. Mia Consalvo has some interesting research on how when players choose like the evil choice, they oftentimes do it for reasons that have nothing to do with morality. They do it because certain branches of the storyline only open up when you choose the other path, and so players come into a game and like choose the hero path, and then later they're like, oh man, but like there's that whole like half of the game that I'm not experiencing. I'm gonna go evil because I want to get there. So that's more about an exploratory impulse. That's not really about like, I don't think of myself as like evil for doing that. It's like I want the full picture of the world. So I think moral choices in games are also a lot, like they're much more complicated than like, I am an evil person and therefore I'm gonna like be a killer and I'm gonna like stab lots of people. Like you can choose to stab lots of things in games for a whole lot of reasons other than, because you're evil and because you like stabbing things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So in AAA game studios especially, do you think that there's sort of a difficulty? And you gave two really great examples with The Last of Us 2 and Death Stranding here. But do you think that there's sort of a difficulty that occurs when trying to make meaningful wandering, but also battling, like making games as accessible to as many people as possible? Like an example that's really fresh in my mind, because I was just talking to someone about it, is like Red Dead Redemption 2, where the wandering and below the surface, the game has a lot to say about like the acceptance of death and like man versus nature. But then on the surface, it's also, in true Rockstar fashion, it's like a white man and as the player, your character is capable of doing horrible things in the game. And it kind of like takes away, there's like a dissonance that occurs when you're trying to like explore the nature or you're doing your wandering, and those are like the areas in the game where you're most immersed is when you're not doing any of the like Rockstar-y video gamey things. And I feel like it's like that trap that you fall into when you're playing a AAA game and you're expecting, you expect a little bit more out of it than you get with the video gaming aspects of it. And I wonder if that's like a thing that indie games can do a little bit better because they're a little bit more free. Like they don't have to be a game for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, the question was, I was wrapped up in listening to it. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to summarize it. The question was, do you think that AAA studios kind of think about, or the devs at AAA studios maybe think about the disjoint between the kind of game that they have to make in order to succeed commercially versus the kind of like artsy, experimental kind of wandering that I'm pointing out here, which you can experience in games like Red Dead Redemption, where on the surface you're doing all of this like very like conventional exploratory gameplay, but then underneath, maybe you're doing all this like subversive wandering, or at least they open up the possibility for you to. Was that more or less it? Yeah, great. Yeah, I think Red Dead Redemption is a great example. One of the things that I liked about working on this chapter, and one of the reasons I forced myself to do it, is because I do mostly study indie games. And at a certain point, it felt like that was shooting fish in a barrel. It's like, oh, this indie game is being weird and experimental and queer. Like, what a surprise, right? Like, you know, call me back when like the AAA game is like doing that. And so one of the things that I really liked about studying AAA games is that I think they do kind of have to be both. And part of it is just an effect of the open worldedness of AAA games. Like once you give players the option to do so much, which is like a mainstay of a AAA game, like you can do so many things in that world, they make it possible for you to do all those things, then the options or the opportunities to subvert what it is that you're supposed to be doing get bigger and bigger. And when you have a huge audience playing, some players are going to find that and take advantage of it and really experience the game that way. So, you know, some players are going to play that game and just be like all about the horse and the horses and just be like, I'm playing this game for the horses. Like, I am a man in love with my horse, and like that's the way I'm experiencing that game. So I think that the bigness of the game makes it possible to like play it as you like. And so they do have to do both. Like if you want a commercially successful big AAA game, it's hard to be as openly subversive as perhaps some of the people on the team might want to be. However, by offering so many possibilities and by leaving that possibility space open, you can make it so that players can remake the game as they like, and so that players, you know, can play through The Last of Us 2, and some of them are gonna feel a sense of spiritual pilgrimage and this feeling that like Ellie just wanders the whole damn country like over and over and like never finds peace because like she isn't dealing with her underlying trauma, and like that's at the core of that game, even though, you know, the actual, like the gameplay loop of that game is just like zombie, 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 more zombie. What's that? Another person to kill? No, it's a zombie. Like that's the gameplay loop, but like the bigger arc of it is this like really deep, powerful statement about pilgrimage and kind of unendurable sadness. So yeah, I think they can do both.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question. Which one? Yeah.
Is AI likely to expand the opportunities to subvert the games versus restrict them, i.e. more adaptive NPCs?
NPCs. Oh, so you're reading something from the YouTube.
It was from YouTube, a handwritten.
Great. Love it. Okay, well then I don't have to repeat it because everyone on YouTube can already see it. Love that. AIs. When AIs can start to subvert something, that's, I think, when we'll know that they're actually something. I think that, so like I just answered the last question, I think the more stuff there is in the game, so the more NPCs that there are to interact with, the more things those NPCs can do, that opens up a bigger possibility space. So to some extent, yes, like if you have a whole lot of AIs playing as NPCs, I could imagine that opening up new possibilities for subversion. I think that AI in general is not, it's just still not that creative a thing. AI can only do remixes and kind of take what you give it and steal everything from the internet and then like put it together in a mishmash and like make make something that isn't in itself going to be subversive. At least I haven't seen that yet. So yeah, I think AI in general is not subversive, but I think that like AI, just by dint of being creating more stuff that happens in games, could lead some human players to more subversive behaviors. Thank you.
And this is end of our time, so thank you very much. This was a great talk. This was a great discussion, so thank you.
Thank you all. Those were great questions. I really appreciated them. Sweet. There.